welcome, everybody. Thank you to this webinar. Today, we can see by the response that this is a topic of great interest around the world, and we're pleased that you can be with us today. This is a very sophisticated audience, so we will not be going over the facts on the ground as we know them. Everybody in this conversation is well aware of them. We want to maximize the time to listen to what our stellar panelists have to say today. For those who have been following the CCA events, you know we've been involved in the Venezuela file for some time. First invitation, I think first time hosting by anybody of María Corina Machado in Canada was done by us over 10 years ago, and we held meetings on the sidelines of the Lima Group meetings in Ottawa, as well other events. So we're very pleased to be back having this conversation, although not pleased per se to be talking exactly about what we're going to be talking about today. There are opportunities to ask questions, but written, please, by using the question and answer box. All of you are veterans of this platform. You know how that works. We will aspire to answer as many as we can, or at least integrate them into our conversation. But as I said, there is a lot of area to cover, a lot of information. So no promises, but we will try. Obviously, this conversation is on the record, and as is with all of our public events, a video will be available on our website, ccacanada.com, by no later than tomorrow, and hopefully by tonight. So with that said, let me start with the introductions of our panelists, all who said, agreed on very, very short notice to be part of this. So we doubly appreciate their efforts to be with us. Ana Covarrubias is a PhD from Oxford. She's a professor researcher, the Center for International Studies at the Colegio de México, and she's an expert in Mexican and Cuban foreign policy, both expertises which we will be calling on during our conversation today. Hussein Kalout is editor-in-chief of the CEBRI-Journal. CEBRI, very good friends of ours in Brazil. We're very, very pleased that they helped us put this seminar together today. Thank you, Hussein. He's also former Secretary of Strategic Affairs in Brazil and a very prominent voice in Brazilian foreign policy. And last but certainly not least, María Mejía is a former Foreign Affairs Minister of Colombia, former permanent representative to the United Nations for Colombia, and the host of a television program, Una Mirada al Mundo, in Caracol TV in Colombia. Thank you, all of us, for being here today. I think we want to start off right away by understanding in each of the three countries what are their particular interests in Venezuela. In terms of coming to a resolution, not just the domestic considerations that they think about, but also the international and even regional and international implications for them. So to start us off, María, perhaps you can talk a little bit from the Colombian angle.
Thank you so much, Ken, and nice to be with Ana and with Hussein in this panel of greater importance, particularly that everything is moving so fast. I mean, we don't even get to 15 days after that famous 28th election day, 28th of July. For Colombia, for President Petro, it is essential. In the domestic, it was one of his first decisions when he got into office 2 years ago. We are commemorating 7th of August, the first 2 years. The turning, the break point on his government of 4 years. So for him, it was the position on Venezuela that changed radically from previous government. And domestically is very important, not only because of the peace efforts internally. Of course, they have an international implication, but internally, the peace is very important for all of us here. And we know that the process of the ELN and the process of gangs crossing in and out and the migration process that has a domestic implication of great consequences. 2.7 migrants registered officially with documents and with cédula de ciudadanía in Colombia. And of course, the financial situation of a frontier of over 2,000 kilometers, in which we arrived 10 years ago to an exchange, a commercial exchange of $8,000 million, and now we are bordering the 700 millions in the new sort of opening of the frontier. So we have like an internal domestic decision that for Petro is important to consolidate relations and to play internationally, externally, a role in the solution of these crossroads with Venezuela. Getting with Mexico, I think it was the first decision. Mexico has been a close ally in the peace process, and of course in the Barbados agreement. They were together all the time in this decision taken like a year ago. So it was important to be together. And Brazil, they are like sort of playing leaderships, Lula and Petro, in the region and in the world. And I think for them it's like to see which of the two plays a higher role and a more strategic role. Today, there was a conversation yesterday between Blinken and Murillo of Colombia, and I think they're trying to move, the United States trying to move a new OAS declaration, and we will see what the position of Colombia would be, if once again they will abstain or if there is a possibility to get into the race. So for Colombia, it's strategic, and the recognition of a fraud or of an illegal result. The not counting of the ballots would not do, even with Gustavo Petro. I think it won't do. How to resolve the problem, we will see, because the communique says CNE is the responsible of that result and not the tribunal, the Supreme Tribunal. So we'll see, but I think to open, I would say that for us is essential, for Petro is essential domestically and externally.
Thank you, María. Hussein, how about the priorities and interests of Brazil in this matter? Oh, you're on mute, Hussein. Now you're off. Okay.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, Ken, and also in the company of Maria, Emma, and Anna to address this very important topic. First of all, allow me to say that the Venezuelan crisis in itself represents a huge challenge to the Brazilian foreign policy, to the Brazilian leadership in South America, and particularly to President Lula's legacy, right? So all in all, I think that how we should decode this problem at all. Secondly, I think Brazil miscalculated its strategy to deal with Venezuela. There is an error in the variables and also in the methodology how to address the Venezuelan regime. First error, Brazil were conceding peremptory a legitimacy and vote of confidence in Maduro since Lula's ascension to power, in the expectation that Maduro will moderate and will respect the opposition. And that has not happened, right? So, and that in certain sense makes some people in the Brazilian government to feel betrayed by Maduro. So we anticipated to you the legitimacy, we trusted you, and then we trusted in your moderation in the Barbados Accord, and at the end, you manipulated the electoral process. Well, of course, there was some peoples within the government, they never believed that Maduro could be honest in all this process, but to Brazil, it was very difficult to repeat the mistake of Guaido, or to move on to a more harsh intervention, whatever it is. So Brazil also were in the context of how to maneuver that smoothly without breaking the bridge with Maduro's regime. One other aspect that it's important to emphasize, that the fraud was in the making. Actually, the fraud did not happen in the day of the election. Actually, the fraud was taking place since months ago, actually, when Maduro basically arrested part of the opposition and canceled or prosecuted part of the competitive candidate that they were able to run against him. And in this regard, Brazil, here there is a disagreement that Brazil should have, in that momentum, address more emphatically Maduro's regime, right? And that Brazil was kind of hesitated to take any hard action. The third aspect of my talk, that in somehow Lula inner circle, they decode the Venezuelan problem not in the angle of democracy and human rights, but the Venezuelan problem as a part of a geopolitical clash between the Western world and the hegemony of the Western world based on intervention and unilateral sanctions versus the challenger and the proponent of a new order represented by China and Russia and the global South, right? That means domestic problems should be solved by domestic actor with the mediation of regional partner, not others. So, the matter of fact, the Brazilian government were convinced, not the Brazilian, the inner circle of Lula's president, were convinced that Maduro will win the election fairly, without fraud, because they were convinced that Maduro's won't commit any illegality that could, alter the final result, because he still had a strong popular support. And in this aspect, they misjudge massively the potential of the opposition and the potential of the opposition to articulate itself and to gain a huge support that culminated in what the opposition declared victory of Edmundo Gonzalez. In that regard, Brazil was basically, to conclude this point, we're basically posted in a trap. And why in a trap? Because at the end, what Brazil saw there, it was really a fraudulent election. And that put the Brazilian government in a defensive position, which they could not recognize Maduro's victory in one hand, right? In the other hand, they know they could not legitimize Edmundo Gonzalez's victory, because that won't help in the negotiation, in the negotiator process. So that is the point, and there where we are. So in my perception, the Brazilian government has a huge challenge to deal with this topic. First, because they know Maduro has the military, has the institutions, has the police, and they have all the apparatus of the state at his disposal. So nothing will compel him to leave power, right? And of course, the National Electoral Council of Venezuela, as well as the Supreme Court, they are not going, or especially the Supreme Court, they are not going to say, well, after an accountability, well, Maduro actually lost the election. That is not conceivable at this point. And basically what it's naturally expected, they're going to confirm Maduro's victory or Maduro triumph, which nobody will believe it. And at this point, coming with the ballots and explain it, it's also irrelevant at this point, right? So Maduro tried to prove that he won fairly. No one gonna believe, because if he won fairly, there were no question to present actually and to give access to independent observer about the factual results. So that said, I think Brazil now is relying on the articulation between Colombia and Mexico in order to exercise pressure over Maduro to say, listen, here you have three important Latin American countries, and these countries, they are not able even to recognize your victory. The matter of fact, that will lead to a institutional collapse and isolation of Venezuela in the region by these actors. But the matter of fact, in my opinion, the objective of each country in this regard is different, right? So the Brazilian objective is not doesn't meet necessarily the Colombian objective and the Mexican objective, which ultimately the three agree in one important guideline. Well, Maduro frauded the election. They agree on that. But how to address it and what, in which kind of instruments and what are the boundaries, I think they do not have a common conception on that. And I will stay here.
Thank you, Hussein. You just highlighted one of the, I think one of the points that's going to come out of this conversation. We'll return to that about, and that was sort of the genesis of the question at the beginning is, are these three countries really aligned on how this might work out? But so we'll have plenty of conversation. But I am reminded when you talk about the Lula government view that Maduro would have been chastised and would have, the experience would have changed his behavior. Reminds me a little bit of the Republicans during the impeachment hearing of Donald Trump, that, you know, he's been chastised and he won't behave like that anymore. We've heard that in other contexts as well. Ana, how about the priorities and interests of Mexico in this situation?
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me for this very timely discussion. I'm very happy to be with Maria Emma and Hussein. Well, in the case of Mexico, Venezuela was really the first issue where the López Obrador government illustrated it was different from previous governments. When López Obrador took office in 2018, we left the Lima group. So ever since, our position regarding Venezuela has been not to interfere. Not intervention from Mexico, obviously, but also the Mexican government has been looking for other countries not to intervene in domestic processes of countries in the region. I have to qualify this assertion because when the candidate is not the one preferred by López Obrador, then he acts differently. But when the candidate or the president, you know, is aligned with López Obrador's ideology, thing is different. And then the main interest of the Mexican government is not to interfere in the domestic processes in Venezuela. So my guess is that by joining Colombia and Brazil, and by signing these communiques, what the Mexican government wants to say is we still maintain that non-intervention is the principle which guides regional relations. We do not want interference from the United States, and we do not want interference by the OAS. By no means. Relations between López Obrador and the OAS have been terrible. So the OAS is not an option for the Mexican government. And so my guess is that by adopting these communiques and by adopting this position, what the López Obrador government wants to say or wants to signal is we cannot intervene. They have to solve their problems between domestic actors, and we can help by sort of facilitating their conversations. We might act perhaps as mediators or communicators, but there should not be external interference in the domestic conflict. And a little bit like Hussein said regarding the Brazilian case, it's the idea or the perception is that, okay, there is a conflict. They haven't been able to show the votes, you know, we don't know the figures, the final figures at all. So we do have a problem, you know. There is a difference between what Maduro says and what the opposition says. But we should not be interfering as long as we do not see the counting of the election. That was López Obrador's first reaction. You know, we have to see the final result, and then we will recognize Maduro if Maduro won. And López Obrador was, you know, I think more or less certain that this was going to be the case. But of course it wasn't. And we haven't had the figure. And that's really what bothers most López Obrador, I think. So in that sense, we are in a very difficult position in terms of not recognizing the fraud. I don't think López Obrador will recognize the fraud. And on the other hand, and not recognizing the opposition, of course. And on the other hand, saying, well, we cannot interfere. So really, I don't see how the Mexican position can evolve if the situation in Venezuela remains in the stalemate.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this sets us up for the next question. As you know, the three countries put out a communique last week about the situation and going forward, and they talked about everybody please stay peaceful and a few other and let's see the actas. Maria Corina and Mundo Gonzalez and then responded by saying, well, look, there's okay, well, they had their own, some of which coincide with that, but two ones that didn't appear in the communique is, look, any conversation that we have has to recognize the opposition win and has to lead to the peaceful transfer of power. That certainly wasn't in the communique. And so the question is, which maybe highlight the differences between the three countries, is how would each of your countries feel about those two conditions by the opposition in Venezuela? If I understood correctly, Maria Emma, is Colombia, and maybe I'm just picking out a few words, they just want peace and they want stability in Venezuela. They may be less concerned about, and particularly for the domestic reasons, how they play on Colombia, about a transition of power to, and the recognition and the transition of power to the opposition. If I understand Mexico correctly, Ana, AMLO just essentially, and I think Claudia said something just very, very recently, the same way as leave it to the international organizations, whatever happens, and the Venezuelans will work it out, and that's sort of their business. And Hussein, at the other end of the spectrum, if Colombia's in the middle of the two, I think you're warming up to say, and tell me if I'm wrong, that Brazil is actually much more on the verge of and wanting to say, look, this needs to be the opposition won this election, fair and square, or not even fair and square, but they still won it, and there needs to be a transition to the opposition. So I want to know if I've summarized that accurately. Let me start with you, Hussein. Is that fair? Does Lula and Lula's people really want? Are they holding themselves back from some way because of maintaining their position with the two other countries and saying just that the opposition won, and there needs to be a peaceful transition? Or are there other factors such as maintaining negotiating space for themselves?
I think, Ken, the broader picture is much more complex than to portray it only in this way, which you have also reason on that, right? But let me frame it in that way. So the Venezuelan problem doesn't have the same weight to all three actors. There's that the Venezuelan problem presents different weight to Mexico, to Brazil, and to Colombia. To Brazil and Colombia particularly, they are there. There are massive refugee mass that they are going to Colombia, coming to Brazil. But the most complex variable to Brazil, it is the Brazilian leadership and Lula by basically legitimizing Maduro regionally in South America more than the other head of states. So, and because he offered himself as the main interlocutor with Maduro instead of Petro. Why? Because Maduro, Lula, and Amorim, they know Maduro since Hugo Chavez, and they were in power when Maduro became president. So they have more access to regime and much more engagement with the Venezuelan regime rather than Petro. In any failure, Brazil will take much more responsibility than Colombia and Mexico, right? So this is important to understand. Second, other point that it's important to underline is Brazil cannot force a transition, right? Why? Because it's not realistic. To force a transition depend on variables, and the variables will not come from the outside. From now till January, US will, or till December, US will be immersed in internal election. So, and US will be involved in its domestic problems and interests, not on Venezuela, right? Of course, the opposition will be rocking and trying to pressure, but the matter of fact that everything will be decided from January and beyond, not before that. So I can't see that Maduro will leave power or Brazil will force him to negotiate till January. This is one. Two, to Maduro to be able to negotiate, so what he has to put over the table to be acceptable for the opposition. The only way that opposition accept, it's either he will submit for a new election with the really independent observers and he will lose the election. That is concrete. Or, give him amnesty. He's not gonna drop power. So, and Brazil knows that. So, and saying to the opposition, well, I'm not going to arrest you anymore and nobody will be prosecuted, that is not sufficient to the opposition. So the situation, it's very delicate, and by all means, the only way that I see that it's possible that compels Maduro to accept a transition, it is a social convulsion, a social revolt internally for months that will lead to a collapse, and that will jeopardize the structure of the regime, and especially the armed forces, because now there is no way to say, that is not accurate to say, oh, the armed forces are split. They are not. They are united and they are with Maduro. But if the social convulsion will move on, and then you have massacres, then the army will be pressured by the population to decide where they stand. But what is very important in this aspect, how the Western power is gonna behave. Because if they try to interfere, things, in my opinion, will get worse. And Brazil won't be able, even regionally, to solve the problem. And remember, Maduro doesn't need Brazil at all. It doesn't need Brazil. Why he needs Brazil? Maduro needs already whom he wants. China put in the money there. Is a rising power, challenging US, hegemony in the world order. He has Russia. Russia is the big supplier of weapons to Venezuela. And he has Cuba, which all the intelligence apparatus and security is made by them to Maduro. So I mean, these are the three main important actors, actually, to the Maduro regimes. And immediately, they recognize Maduro, and especially China and Russia, Maduro's victory, immediately. So he knows that he has the back of China and Russia. Well, to conclude my argument, there's two interpretations in Brazil. One, and two hypotheses, actually. One, well, Brazil cannot deal with this problem. It is fait accompli. This is the status quo. Last election that Maduro won, it was based on fraud. Brazil did not recognize the victory of Maduro immediately. It took some time, but Brazil did not send any representative to Maduro inauguration. But the Labour Party, the PT, sent some delegation. Well, this scenario is likely to happen. Brazil does not recognize the victory of Maduro, and Brazil doesn't, and Lula doesn't go, and he do not send that, and he don't send no one from his government, but the PT would go there. The matter of fact that we will have a situation de facto on the ground, which, like it or not, Brazil has to deal with Venezuela. And that will be an informal recognition of the regime, even if not an explicit recognition. So this is one scenario, one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is look at, and some people think on that here, it's, well, Brazil cares about democracy, Brazil cares about human rights, but the problem is much larger than that. And why? Well, Venezuela is a key piece on a geopolitical clash between US and the West, China and Russia, and put it this global South, and Brazil includes itself, this government particularly includes itself in this mainstream. Means Maduro losing or Maduro leaving power, that represents a defeat for this new for the new proponent of or new challenger of the world order. Maduro, the opposition winning, or the transition and the opposition ascending to power, that means victory of US and its allies. So here at the in conclusion, even Brazil, this government, respect democracy and human rights. At the end, the calculus could be literally geopolitical, beyond democracy and human rights, which means, well, I mean, at the end, we will prefer Maduro, but Maduro within our domain rather than Venezuela with domain of US and the Western powers. And well, people could say, well, this is a quite hypocrite and cynic, but then Brazil will say, well, I mean, the West has been hypocrite in several portfolios across the world since decades ahead, so why we cannot be hypocrite in this regard? So we're gonna use the same metric of hypocrisy that the West has used. So that it is one of the main variables that Brazil is dealing with.
Thank you very much, Hussein. Maria, let me come to you on this.
Which I do not necessarily can agree with that, but just I'm trying to portray how people think.
Got it.
In Brasilia, right?
That's very well understood, and there are a couple points we can come back to about how bad does a situation get. You mentioned in your comments, if things get really bad on the ground, and they're getting bad, they're very bad already, and the question is, okay, well, then particularly under your analysis, if it gets really, 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 really bad, it's not clear to me that the calculus by the Brazil government is everything. If they're going to see it in the geopolitical battle as it's viewed, as they view it between the U.S. and the global South, et cetera, and non-intervention. So it's unclear that, you know, God knows what could happen on the ground, and still wouldn't necessarily change the tactics. But we can have that conversation. Maria, when I summarized before, I said, well, what really would President Petro find an acceptable solution in Venezuela, given the fact that the opposition has said what's non-negotiable is the recognition of the opposition victory and a peaceful transition to power. How would President Petro view all of that?
I see it as too soon, and I see a window, an opportunity in the 6 months we have until the taking office in 2025. I see it too soon to think of the negotiation, of a direct negotiation between the opposition and Maduro's government. That is to say, Maria Corina and President Maduro. I don't see the possibility of them resolving this problem or talking in the near future of recognition of Edmundo González and of the possibility of a peaceful transition. It has to go some time, but I'm sure the pressure would be so high, like never before in Venezuela. Not with the Adecos and Copellanos in the old days, when the coups to Carlos Andrés Pérez by then Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez, not in 1512, when it was defeated the opposition, or in the 15 when it was defeated the government. It was the very first time the government was defeated in the assembly, the National Assembly, and they went to the opposition and they did opposition. I do see a Maduro that is not ready to leave. It's not an amnesty and going away in the near future, even if the fraud, even if the Electoral Council is given the power again to have a solution. Because what will happen in 15 days, 10 days, the tribunal, the Supreme Tribunal, will give its verdict, which Maduro said it would be law and sentence, last words. It won't be recognized either by the three countries. I mean, they cannot continue to say that they recognize Lula, Maduro, Lula, Petro, and AMLO will say, yes, okay, we recognize that decision and the issue is closed. No. So the pressure will continue. The difference with the opposition this time is that it is an opposition well constructed, well designed. If Maduro, as Hussein said, had the time to plan this for not on the 28th of July, but well before, and he structured allies since October 23rd, when the agreement of Barbados was signed. Same did the opposition. The opposition structured itself, got together all the different factors of the opposition for the very first time, and they really got the people of Venezuela. The diaspora that couldn't vote, the 4.5 million that were not allowed to vote, and the difference in the results could have been even stronger. That diaspora would be there, would be on Saturday the 17th, when this march takes place, we hope, and it will be a massive message to the world. Something that the world cannot say, I will not recognize. So we have more and stronger sanctions to Venezuela. We will have a stronger political message. We will have the OAS. I agree. I don't see President Petro signing an OAS declaration even now. I may be mistaken, but I don't see him signing a new declaration or see the important effect. It's an easy solution for the United States to say, let's sign a declaration by the OAS about the results. So I think there's still the possibility to pressure Maduro in such a way, not waiting until the 5th of November of the result of the United States election and Harris or whomever, but it appears that it could be, I hope, that the Democrats could win. But I see a solution much sooner, and I see a solution that it won't involve Nicolas Maduro, and it won't involve him leaving the country and asking for asylum or seeking somewhere else. The only way for him to survive, if survive in the sense of passing on in the opposition, let's say, in continuing a government, is, of course, if he stays in Venezuela. Otherwise, the court, I mean, one compares it to the no in the plebiscite of Pinochet, but we didn't have the Treaty of Rome. So I think he has to stay in Venezuela. He could do opposition like they did in with the power they had, with the tribunal, with the Attorney General's office. They destroyed the power of the assembly, and Guaidó, who was the president, really didn't have the power in 2015. So I think it would be an issue in which he will be against, like in the box matchings, against the courts, and he will have to see the possibility of a transition, that is not a transition. It sounds light, a transition. No, it won't be a peaceful transition. But he has the people of Venezuela, the opposition, or the country has the people of Venezuela. And I think Petro is very much lean towards people's decision. You saw it in his call for the popular constitution. You know, it's the people. So I think it would be a saying. Much has to happen before there is a call for what we recognize that he won. No, it cannot be possible. So countries, international pressure, sanctions, people on the streets, and of course, with the human cost that we've seen in other conflicts in the world, you know, that they can pressure Maduro. But I don't see a possibility of a 6 months waiting for this, or him taking office in January 2025.
Okay, two things, if I could just follow up, but then, and Anna, I'll come to you on the Mexican point of view. One of them is, you mentioned the protests that the opposition has called for this Saturday on August 17th. And if I understood you correctly, do you think that if it's as massive as one might imagine it could be, that will be another data point that could influence how this process goes, and more importantly, for purposes of this conversation, could view how President Petro views his tactics in handling this situation? Do you think is that going to be a critical showing for let's just say for President Petro to see what that looks like?
I am absolutely sure of that, because I think it would be a demonstration of an opposition for the very first time in Venezuela, independent of ideologies that I don't think Petro coincides very much with the opposition's ideology. Is much more lean towards Maduro. They've become sort of close to one another. They restructure relations. He has visited him 5 times in Venezuela in these 2 years. But I think that the way she has been able, or the opposition has been able, to call on people and to call of peoples of all the diaspora and all the Latin American feeling, you know, and Ibero-American feeling, I think it would mean a lot to a president that is based his 2 years to come on the possibility of the people, on the possibility of social movement, on social constitutional, popular constitution. So I think it will make, it's not a one-time issue. It has to continue. What is the strategy of the opposition, and how these 3 countries can merge? Alone, they cannot do anything. So if Brazil is not there, even for the wrong reasons, or Mexico's not there, and they're not the 3 together, it cannot be solved. So they need to continue to be together, to speak to Maduro, that conversation that hasn't happened yet after 15 days, and it hasn't happened. So I think it would need a lot of strength.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I mean, it seems it's the unity point is one of the ones that we've been playing around with here, because if I understood Hussein correctly, he really doesn't think Brazil has much influence in this, right? If Hussein, I don't think I am misquoting you on that, and can certainly do something alone, as I think he said, Venezuela doesn't need Brazil. But that's not quite the situation with Colombia. There's a very, very different dynamic from Colombia. So while there's three countries acting together, it seems one is more equal than the other two, and that one being Colombia. And it would seem to be out of the three, in influence, and also the repercussions back and forth between the two countries. Certainly if this gets worse, which Colombia knows what that could look like at its border and elsewhere, or if it were even to get better, that it would more immediately affect Colombia, and because President Petro theoretically has more influence. I think that's where we are between the two of you so far. Does that sound right, Maria?
Yes.
Maria, yeah, okay.
Yes, it sounds right.
Yeah. Hussein, I didn't misinterpret your comments, right? All right, I'm going to go to Anna. Well, let me go to Anna, and then and then you can tell me about. But you're on mute, Hussein. But let me go to Anna first, and then you can tell me how I misinterpreted. I mean, Anna,
you made it clear and crystal better than myself. Actually, in fact, Brazil has limits to impose its willing, and they know that. And they know whatever leverage they try to exercise, that will be not only limited, but will have a small effect.
got it. Okay. Thank you for that. Anna, thank you for being patient. Well, you've heard the conversation about the relative influence and impact of Brazil and Colombia. And as I think we discussed a little bit earlier, it's, first of all, Mexico starts, as I think, if I understand it, with a position of not terribly interested, or not terribly interested in becoming engaged in itself. Do you think Mexico, and so I want to actually tap on your expertise, not in Mexico, but the Cuba aspect of it as well. But let's start with Mexico. Do you think that is there a bottom line for AMLO, do you think, in how this gets resolved? In other words, are there certain things, certain minimum conditions that should be respected? And or if things get terribly wrong on the ground, even worse than they're becoming now, which we all know about in terms of the repression, I think the UN reported 23 deaths yesterday, close to 1,600 detentions, et cetera, with no sign of it letting up. Is there any point at which AMLO may say, or Claudia, coming from behind, might say, this is just a little bit too much for us, right? This is there any point there?
Well, that's a very good question. I see that López Obrador will find it very difficult to recognize the opposition, or in a certain point in time say, listen, this is unacceptable. He hasn't said that, on other cases. But let me take Brazil and Colombia as references to see the position of Mexico. First of all, I found it very interesting what Hussein said. For Mexico, in contrast to Lula, the Venezuelan case was really the main example to show a new regional insertion. We were not anymore with the democracy, human rights side. We were taking sides with the left in the region. And instead of a rhetoric of democracy and human rights, which I think was what I understood from what Hussein said, for the Mexican government, the rhetoric is non-intervention, self-determination, and sovereignty. So that's a very interesting difference with Brazil. We're not defending human rights here. We're not defending democracy necessarily. Our main concern is that sovereignty is violated, is that someone external interferes in Venezuela. So I think that's a very interesting comparison with the Brazilian case. And in terms of the Colombian case, what Maria Emma said regarding Petro's possible support to social movements, that has not been the way in which AMLO sees things, especially in international affairs. So again, I think Mexico has very clear limits to what to do in terms of the opposition in Venezuela. Let's just imagine that on Saturday, let's hope not, but probably there is massive repression. I think that would be very difficult for the Mexican government to say something. Probably they will say that, you know, repression is not acceptable, etc. But that doesn't mean that they will condemn Maduro. That's, I think, my main point. I think they will not be willing to condemn Maduro. The Mexican government is not willing to take any position without the counting of the votes. And I think they will stick to that position very strongly, which is in a way, well, terrible because, you know, it goes beyond the counting of votes now. You know, the conflict has gone, you know, ahead, you know, has moved from that the position. Then regarding one of the questions in the chat, they said, well, the OAS has been trying to do something. It has been unsuccessful. I'd like to say one thing. I think for the first time, I may be wrong, but I think for the first time, the Mexican government decided not to be in the discussion. You know, when the Cuban Revolution, when the Nicaraguan Revolution, when Guatemala in 1954, the Mexican government was not disagreed with what the OAS decided, but it was there discussing and voting either against or abstaining. In this case, the president gave the instruction to the Mexican representative of the OAS not to be in the discussion. This is really something new. And in my opinion, is unacceptable. If you're against the resolution, vote against the resolution. If you don't want to say anything, abstain, but do not be absent. I mean, there is a forum where you can, you know, express your opinion. And for the first time, I think the Mexican government decided not to be there, which is really unusual, really, really unusual. And regarding CELAC, which was in the question, what the Mexican government did when it took the pro tempore presidency of CELAC was to take the Venezuelan case off. You know, they wanted to depoliticize CELAC. That is impossible. We tried, the pandemic came, you know, the subjects of discussion changed, but the Mexican government, ever since López Obrador took power, was to say non-intervention, non-interference. We're not saying anything about the political process in Venezuela. And I think that will continue to be unless something really dramatic happens on Saturday. Then let's see what happens. And in terms of Brazil, I also wanted to say, well, Lula, the first Lula back in time, was very keen on being the regional leader. And in the Mexican case, there is no such ambition nowadays. So it has been, you know, there is also a very interesting contrast in terms of what Brazil can do or Lula can do more personally. And in the case of Mexico, it's non-intervention, non-interference, self-determination, and a low profile. And that also explains why the Mexican government wanted to take the Venezuelan case out of CELAC. You know, we're not saying anything about domestic processes in other countries because we do not want other countries to say anything about domestic processes in Mexico. You know, one of the main objectives of López Obrador foreign policy is to avoid other countries from saying anything regarding democracy, human rights, and the political process in Mexico. And finally, regarding Cuba, what is really interesting is that after the two pan governments and the pre-government, we are having now very close relations with Cuba. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are any conversations between Mexico and the Cuban government regarding the Venezuelan case. I believe Mexico is well aware that if we want any solution in Venezuela, it has to go through Cuba in a way, you know, again, unless something really terrible happens in Saturday, we don't know. But my guess is that probably the Mexican government and the Cuban government have been having conversations on the basis that both governments would prefer Maduro to remain in power, right? Because of ideological considerations, because of giving a space of autonomy in the region vis-a-vis the United States. But none of this has been made public, of course. And the last thing I wanted to say is regarding, again, Brazil. If I'm not mistaken, on Monday or Tuesday after the elections, Brazil and Biden had a telephone conversation regarding Venezuela. I don't see the Mexican government doing anything like that. You know, if there will be some other regional countries to discuss the Venezuelan case, that would most probably be Cuba, not the United States. And I believe that the OAS is for Mexico, not the forum to be discussing the Venezuelan case.
Fantastic, Anna. We're at the end of our time. If the panelists, but I want to give the panelists any time. Based on Anna said a number of things, and María, I saw you shaking your head yes up and down to a number of them. But just any reflections on her comments?
Well, I see that.
I think particularly about Cuba, you were definitely nodding to her points about Cuba.
I see that, I don't know if I have my phone, I see in Cuba as well with the Colombian government, with Petro, I see the importance of Cuba and Mexico. We've seen it all along in this no period of peaceful negotiations with the ELN in particular. And I know that power that it may have in these last stages of how to solve this problem. It is not votes. I know the legitimacy would come from counting the votes, but it is over. I mean, we're 15 days away, and everybody knows, the world recognizes that Maduro didn't win and the opposition did win this election. So the fraud is difficult to hide. And Cuba is very powerful today. It has been very quiet, like always. And I think it is that diplomacy that it may, in this time, help, not via the United States, that is the problem, but I think Petro has certain key issues with Mexico, with Brazil for other reasons, but they have got together in environment and other issues, and they're fighting or sort of competing on leadership in the region. We will have CELAC here at the beginning of next year in Bogota. And I think there is a possibility to enhance and to have an opportunity to influence a bit in the conversation towards a solution. I don't see, I repeat, and I end with this, I don't see Maduro in the presidency in January 2025. No way.
Very interesting. Okay, Hussein, last question for you, and unless all the panelists want to keep talking, this is very interesting, but I know you have very many commitments, and we would like to make this, this isn't the last, hopefully, conversation amongst all of us about this situation. We'll have to monitor what goes on, but we would like to convene this again at appropriate time. But Hussein, let me see if I understand this correctly. If the United States, and everybody thinks that that's not the case, is successful or could offer something in the way of amnesties, right? That's been, people been reading about, have been talking about. If in fact that were something that might get Maduro or some of his people to go along with and like, it almost sounds as if you're saying, and that could quote solve or certainly move the resolution a lot further along to a recognition of the will of the people in Venezuela. That it almost sounds as if you're saying that Lula might not like that because he's so more, the bigger principle he's wed to is the global South and the breaking of the old hegemonic bloc represented by the United States. Is that? I mean, in other words, would people would any of these three countries get in the way of the U.S. trying to resolve this, through whatever means they have? I'm not talking about armed intervention. I'm talking about through peaceful means, through what are incentives. Would Brazil not welcome that?
I mean, very interesting what you're pointing out. Military intervention won't solve the problem, in my opinion, and most of the countries in South America will be against that.
Right.
Right.
That's not on the table.
Even like Boric, who has posted himself against Venezuela, won't agree with that, for example.
Right. Understood.
Even countries in the right wing, like Paraguay, won't agree. So this is a very key point to highlight. The other question, mechanism of incentives to make the regime to accept transition. Well, I see that.
I mean, Hussein, if I could interrupt just for a second, it's without getting too much into the incentive. Let's just assume that there might be some hope for incentives, and maybe that's a wrong assumption. If nobody on the panel thinks at this point that well, some people might think that could work to a degree, but let's just say that is an option, and it is an option that might be attractive to Maduro or some of his people. Let's say the country really in a position to broker that or to offer the things what they would want would be the United States, maybe others, but primarily it's the fear of the courts of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. If the United States were to advance in the conversations with Maduro, going down the line, and Maduro and his people saying, look, we like this idea of lifting not the sanctions, but the immunities from further prosecution. Let's keep talking about this. Maybe we can come to an understanding. I guess the basic question is, would Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil say, oh, no. Would they stand in the way of that? Because
I don't think they will stand in the way.
View of where they want things to end up in the end, or no, they wouldn't stand in the way.
I don't think they will stand on the way. But the question here, what will be the credibility of offering amnesty to Maduro? Because in the past, U.S. has offered amnesty to other world leaders, and they break their words, and that has happened, right? So by giving the credibility, I offer my credibility, I will give you amnesty. Look to the Iranian nuclear program. Obama negotiated with the Iran side the treaty, came Trump and just throw it up in the garbage. So the matter of fact, whom gonna believe in a credible proposal of amnesty offered by the United States? I'm not here trying to saying that is not credible, but look into the past, right? Recent past. This is one. Second, in one hand, if U.S. comes with an offer of credible amnesty, then the Chinese and the Russian will come with another offer to Maduro to remain in power. Don't forget, Venezuela today hosts the largest oil reserve in the world. That is the point. I mean, so that's what I'm not so optimistic about it. I don't think Brazil will oppose, as the other countries, a peaceful transition with a full amnesty to Maduro. Perhaps he wants to go to Cuba and stay in Cuba, or in Moscow. He won't come to Brazil, but he will either go to one of these two countries or to China, and Brazil won't oppose that. But the matter of fact, Maduro will believe in that, and I think he will be convinced by China, Cuba, and Russia that he will be sooner or later betrayed. That is the point.
Fair enough. Okay. Anna, any final comment on that?
Well, yes, I tend to agree with Hussein. So yes, we will have to wait and see what happens on Saturday. I think that will be probably the turning point. I don't know. And as I said, I think the Mexican position will try to stick to these principles of non-intervention and self-determination. And in terms of the United States, our relations with the U.S. are so complex and difficult these days because of the capture of some drug dealers and some drug-related issue.
Right.
That in that sense, I think what the Mexican government would not support a U.S. solution. That's what I think. I might be wrong, but that's what I think today, Tuesday. But I do think that in terms of more intervention from the U.S., the Mexican government will denounce that intervention. That's all they're going to do. And of course, they might offer a political asylum to Maduro. I don't think Maduro wants to come to Mexico, but it might be a fact. We did receive Evo. Of course, he later went to Argentina, but he was here. So it might be another way of taking Maduro out, if that helps. But I don't think he would stay here at all. And let's see what happens on Saturday. I think that's going to be very interesting.
Thank you, Ana. María, I give you the honor of the last word.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I think we will have many of these over the next few days. And let's see on Saturday what happens. Let's see the two sides of the Maduro regime. I mean, we have the Rodriguez on the one side, and we have of course Diosdado and the Minister of Defense on the other. They are waging their power inside the balance of Maduro, and of course we have in the opposition Edmundo González, an old tradition diplomat who would take office in case anything happens, not María Corina Machado. So that gives leverage to other people as well that we will see. But things are moving. They won't stay like this, and no military intervention, and I think no going away for Maduro. But we will see Saturday as well as you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, María. And by the way, we'll keep in the back of the mind your prediction about what will happen in January. And sooner than January, I think you said. We will hopefully be able to convene you all again at an appropriate time. Mil gracias. Muito obrigado for all of your time. Again, on very short notice, we put this together and you immediately stepped forward to help. Thank you for all those who have been watching from around the world. As I said, we will reconvene. A video of this should be available on our website, ccacanada.com, by tonight and tomorrow at the latest. For everybody, at least in this hemisphere, have a great rest of your day. And if you're in Europe or in Australia where you're listening, have a good evening or early morning, I suppose. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Gracias. Hasta luego.
Gracias.
Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias. Hasta luego. Thank you.
Bye-bye.